Time, 1908. The event, the Grand Prix of France. But these great racing cars and their daring drivers are about to take a back seat to a still greater racing event that same year. It was a New York City to Paris great automobile race. And the car that went around the world to win that race was the Buffalo-built Thomas Flyer motor car. On permanent display at the Hara Automobile Museum in Sparks, Nevada, it came back to Buffalo for a month-long display 81 years later, thanks to the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society and Rich Products. The location, Rich's Research Center on the city's west side, the one-time site of the E.R. Thomas Company plant, which manufactured the legendary motor car, as well as the World War I Curtiss Jenny trainer planes. Buffalonian George Schuster, a chief mechanic for Thomas, was behind the wheel at the finish line. He died in 1972 at the age of 99. So it isn't unusual to hear Jeff Maul recall some of the exciting accounts of that great race, as told to him by George Schuster, his great-grandfather.
There was an international team comprised of the American car, the German car, which was the Protos. That was manned by German military staff. There were 3 French cars and 1 Italian. These were the competitors that actually started, and only 3 of those finished the race.
All of the cars flew the American flag. This was provided by the American Automobile Association with the premise that the winning car would be able to return the flag to New York for a $1,000 prize at the end of the race. This is the Thomas as it looked on that day. It was a stock 1907 model, taken right off the floor of the New York City showroom. There was, of course, no time to modify it. As you can see, it didn't offer any of the amenities we take for granted today, windshields, roof. They were exposed to all of the elements. The car sold for $4,000. It measured 11 feet 8 inches long and weighed approximately 3,600 pounds. Its 4-cylinder, 60-horsepower engine was capable of doing 60 miles per hour. It would get roughly 10 miles to the gallon. Being chain drive, it required considerable maintenance in the drivetrain assembly.
I'm looking at the so-called fenders. Are those canvas fenders?
Yes, originally the car came with steel fenders. Those were removed shortly after the start of the race because of their weight. When they were transporting the vehicle from Seattle to Japan, part of the race course, the car was transported in the hold of a ship. Great-Gramp decided through the course of the voyage to go down and inspect the car, see how it was traveling, and he noticed at that time that all of the leather fenders were missing. And the captain said that he knew something was afoot because all of the coolies had new soles on their sandals. So the captain immediately directed the ship's sailmaker to produce the canvas fenders.
It was February 12th, 1908. This is the scene in Times Square. Some 250,000 New Yorkers turned out to view the start of the race. This is a scene shuffling off to Buffalo, New York, which was to take some 7 days. A blizzard started 20 miles outside of New York City with 2 feet of snow falling the night of February 12th. It took 10 hours to cover some 22 miles. This is a scene outside Rochester, New York.
They would use the block and tackle to winch to the nearest tree. Well, not often were there trees available, so they would enlist the aid of either farmers and their teams, oftentimes hooking 6 to 8 horses at a time on the front of the Thomas to literally drag it through whatever predicament it found itself in. Crossing through Japan, of course, horses weren't that common, and there was one instance where they used that rope to actually climb a mountain, and there were some 45 coolies that actually took hold of the front rope and literally dragged the Thomas to the top of the peak. The backside of the mountain, the brakes would have never held, so the coolies then attached the rope to the rear of the car and lowered the Thomas down the backside of that mountain.
Am I looking at a seat belt?
Yes.
Come on, they didn't have seat belts in 1908.
Well, they didn't have seat belts until in 1908, until this race. The idea was to drive literally night and day without stopping. The seat belt at that time was installed to permit George Miller and my great-grandfather to rotate driving assignments. The idea of the belt was to literally strap them into the car so they wouldn't fall out while they were sleeping. Basically, the route was New York to Albany to Buffalo to Chicago, and probably the next major point would have been crossing through Tonopah, Nevada was quite a spot on the course. From there, they went through Death Valley on to San Francisco. From San Francisco, they loaded a steamer to Seattle, another steamer to Valdez. When they got to Valdez, of course, they found that it was quite impossible to navigate Alaska. They then returned to Seattle, shipped across the Pacific to Japan, crossed Japan, then crossed the Sea of Japan, entered Siberia in the area of Vladivostok, crossed through Siberia, Manchuria, Eastern Europe, about where Moscow is today, on through Berlin, down to Paris, and completed the race in Paris.
How many days?
It took 169 days to accomplish that course.
The American team entered Paris, France, July the 30th, 1908. Outside the city gates, a local gendarme stopped the car for routine inspection. It was here that the gendarme noticed that the driving lamp of the Thomas was broken and inoperative. Of course, local regulations required that any automobile in Paris had to have operative lamps. A local Parisian with a bicycle, overhearing the predicament, offered use of his bicycle lamp. Not being able to remove the lamp without considerable damage to the bicycle, the team lashed the bicycle onto the hood of the Thomas Flyer, and the Thomas drove into the city of Paris with a bicycle lashed to its hood. This was Saturday, August the 15th, 1908, and arrival in New York City. On Sunday, August 16th, there was a ticker tape parade to City Hall. It was then on to Sagamore Hill to meet then-President Teddy Roosevelt.
Yet 4 years later, the company's out of business. Now, it's hard to believe. Why did that happen?
Well, at the time that the Thomas was in production, there were relatively few companies, and they were all building relatively expensive cars. When Henry Ford introduced the Model T, which was a mass-produced car, sold for about 1/10 of what the Thomas sold for. That, of course, captured the American imagination. It was at that time then that with the mass-produced automobile that spelled the end for the Thomas Company.
But it'll go down in history as one of the greatest.
Certainly will.
George Schuster was 35 years old at the time of the race and had been working for the Thomas Flour Company as their chief mechanic. His father was a German immigrant, a blacksmith in the Kaiser's army. As a boy, he worked in his blacksmith shop where he settled in South Buffalo, New York. It seemed only natural for him to work with things mechanical, and the automobile had always fascinated him. It was on Tuesday, February 11th, 1908, in Rhode Island. While he was demonstrating a car, he received word from the factory in Buffalo that the Thomas Company would be entering a car in the New York to Paris race. Being short notice, he was to board a train that evening for New York City, where the race would begin, and he was to pick up the entrant car. The race was started in February to permit an all-land route from New York City to Paris, France. The concept was to drive across the United States, freighter from San Francisco to Seattle, transship to Valdez, Alaska, drive across Alaska, across the frozen Bering Strait, down through Siberia, and through the balance of Asia and Europe, making his way finally to his destination in Paris. It was a 22,000-mile course. It was to start on the next day, February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, something which had never been attempted before. The route indicated in red is the proposed route. As we'll see later, this became totally impossible. The route actually taken is in black. Again, the red route was the proposed route. The black route was the route finally traversed. It was February 12th, 1908. This is the scene in Times Square. Some 250,000 New Yorkers turned out to view the start of the race. The mayor of New York was to start the race originally. However, the crowd was so dense that he couldn't make his way to the starting stand. It was at 11:15 that the president of the American Automobile Association raised a gold-plated pistol into the air and fired the shot that started the race. Protocol called for the other entrants, being foreign nationals, to begin the race, followed by the Thomas, which brought up the rear. This is the Thomas as it looked on that day. It was built on 1200 Niagara Street in Buffalo. It was a stock 1907 model, taken right off the floor of the New York City showroom. There was, of course, no time to modify it. As you can see, it didn't offer any of the amenities we take for granted today: windshields, roof. They were exposed to all of the elements. The car sold for $4,000. It measured 11 feet 8 inches long and weighed approximately 3,600 pounds. Its four-cylinder 60-horsepower engine was capable of doing 60 miles per hour. It would get roughly 10 miles to the gallon. Being chain drive, it required considerable maintenance in the drivetrain assembly. A well-known racer who had competed in the Glidden Tour, 25-year-old Monty Roberts, was designated as the driver for the first leg of the race. George Schuster was to be the mechanic, and they also carried as a passenger Mr. T. Walter Williams, a New York Times correspondent and photographer. The New York Times had arranged with the Le Matin, who was the co-sponsoring paper, a Parisian newspaper, to sponsor the race. Other entries in the race included 3 French cars. This is the French de Dion, driven by St. Chauffery, who was driver and captain, and he represented the Le Matin. He was aristocratic. With him, he had a Norwegian explorer, Captain Hans Hansen, of some fame at the time, probably one of the more knowledgeable men of the Arctic regions. 2 mechanics. This was the heaviest of the cars, weighed 6,600 pounds, 4-cylinder, 30 horsepower, capable of 50 miles per hour. This had a shaft drive, also had studded tires. All of the cars flew the American flag. This was provided by the American Automobile Association with the premise that the winning car would be able to return the flag to New York for a $1,000 prize at the end of the race. This is the ZUST, the Italian car, measured 9 feet 6 inches long, weighed 3,520 pounds, 4-cylinder, 40 horsepower. This was also capable of doing 60 miles per hour. The Italians on this car were the youngest of the group. Most of the men were in their late 20s or early 30s. However, the Italian team were all in their early 20s, and there was one teenager. The rest of the competitors referred to this car as the children's car. This is the German Protos, which proved to be the major competitor in the race. It was the largest car at 16 feet 4 inches, weighed 6,000 pounds. It had a six-cylinder engine, which developed 40 horsepower and was capable of speeds up to 70 miles per hour. It carried with it 176 gallons of fuel. Kaiser Wilhelm ordered this car to be built in 16 days. The Kaiser personally owned 14 cars himself. His intention in entering Germany into the race was to prove the military capabilities of the automobile. The crew was all German military staff. The captain of the team was Lieutenant Hans Koppen, who was driver and captain, on leave from the German General Staff. The other 2 competitors in the race, both being French, were not found to be true viable competitors. One dropped out in Chicago. The other, a 15-horsepower Césarine Nadine, didn't make it to Albany. This is a scene shuffling off to Buffalo, New York, which was to take some 7 days. A blizzard started 20 miles outside of New York City, with 2 feet of snow falling the night of February 12th. It took 10 hours to cover some 22 miles. After leaving Albany, the crew decided to use the towpath of the Erie Barge Canal. A sleet storm outside of Syracuse later proved this to be too hazardous to continue. The fear was falling into the canal system, so the crew then took to the open fields. Some days through the course of the race, the snow permitted advances of some 9 to 10 miles. The Zust, Dion, and Thomas broke way for each other during this part of the race. This is a scene outside of Rochester, New York. it was quite often necessary to walk ahead of the car or use a team of horses to probe the snow. Many times they would enlist the aid of local farmers to hitch teams of 6 to 8 horses at a time to literally drag the Thomas through snowdrifts. This gives a little better idea of exactly how the Thomas was equipped. In Buffalo, a 35-gallon fuel tank was added, gravity flow, which you can see just forward of the rear seat. A rear axle was also corrected deficiencies in the rear axle, and the front axle was straightened to permit greater road clearance. The fourth seat was also added to permit George Miller of Buffalo, New York, passage on the car. From Buffalo to west of Chicago, George would drive the pilot car, oftentimes bucking through snowdrifts ahead of the Thomas to permit easier passage for the Thomas. It was hard to decide whether the mud of Nebraska and the Midwest was worse than the snow fields that they faced in the east. They referred to this as gumbo. Mud would often be 2 feet thick, and it was not unusual for the car to stall going downhill due to the thickened condition of the mud. The mud would freeze at night, freezing not only to the road surface but to the car itself, oftentimes adding hundreds of pounds of weight to the vehicle. This is the home of Buffalo Bill Cody, just outside of Omaha, where the crew was invited to stop for lunch. It was at this point that Hans Hansen was added to the American team. He had had a personality conflict with St. Joffrey and requested passage aboard the American entrant. His use was felt quite an addition because of his knowledge of the Arctic regions. This is a picture of the Union Pacific, which aided the travelers considerably in passing through the areas of the Midwest, particularly mountain passes. The Thomas Flyer was actually designated to be a train and given permission to ride on the ties. It was not permitted for the cars to actually traverse the rails, as this would not have been an overland, considered at that time an overland passage. The difficulty, of course, was in covering large distances, sometimes hundreds of miles from tie to tie, giving great jolts to both the crew and to the vehicle itself. At one point, they blew 3 tires in less than 2 hours. This is the copy of the travel order issued by the Union Pacific, which designated the Thomas Flyer an actual engine. It gave it routing over the rails and included it in its schedule. The Thomas carried red lanterns and fuses. At one point, it also carried a conductor to make it an official train of the Union Pacific. Of course, the sidings weren't always convenient, and it often became necessary to literally winch the Thomas over each rail, especially when passage of an oncoming freight dictated. Here you can see Hans Koppen on the winch line in the process of literally lifting the car over the rail to a siding area. Like all good tourists, they had to make a stop at Pikes Peak. This proved one of the easier climbs at that time. This is a scene outside of Tonopah, Nevada. It was at this point that Monty Roberts, the professional driver, left the race for the Glidden Tour back in New York City. George Schuster became driver and captain of the team at this point, with George Miller being added as mechanic. Outside of Tonopah, they ran into difficulty fording this stream. Of course, there weren't any bridges or road at the time, and often had to resort to horse trails and wagon trails. It was at this stream they encountered quicksand, the Thomas sinking into the mire, and at this point stripping 6 teeth from the pinion gear. George Schuster recalled that a dentist in Tonopah, some 60 miles back, had a Thomas Flyer. The plan was to return to Tonopah, pick up the needed parts from the dentist car, and return them and make the repairs to the Thomas. After walking some 8 miles that night, darkness closed in. George entered a local ranch house. Knocking on the door, he was greeted with the voice of a woman who said, "If you come any further, I'll shoot." Her menfolk were in town. After explaining the predicament he was in, she offered him the use of the stable to sleep for the night. He was awoken some hours later by the sound of voices, and finding them to be friendly, two individuals from Tonopah had come out, those pictured in the black hats to the left of the picture, offered him a ride back to Tonopah. He convinced the dentist that the parts would be replaced promptly by the Thomas Company, took those parts and brought them back to the car. The problem, of course, was the quicksand. They had to literally dam up both sides of the car, tunnel out underneath the car, remove the defective part, then sliding in on his back, he carried in the new pinion assembly and reassembled it in the mud. This is the scene in San Francisco. They arrived in San Francisco March the 24th, some 42 days after the start of the race. They had covered 3,836 miles. At this point, they were 11 days ahead of the number 2 Zust. The Thomas was the first car to cross the United States in winter. It was here that they loaded a steamer for Seattle and on to Valdez, Alaska. A young lady with a child in her arms approached George at the dock and offered her a small silk flag which wrapped a baby's shoe. She offered it to him as a good luck token. He carried that shoe and the flag for the balance of the race. He carried the flag not so much as a good luck charm, but with the thought of using it as identification. With the flag in his vest pocket, should something happen to him in some of the uncharted regions of the world at that time, the hope was that the flag would present enough identification so that the local inhabitants would know who to contact in the event of emergency. This is the scene at Valdez, Alaska, where the Thomas was offloaded onto the pier. At that time, there were some 789 residents in the city of Valdez. All of the residents turned out for the welcoming that morning, save one. The local factory had a steam boiler which required tending. The one individual was required to remain at the factory, although he did make his presence known by sounding the steam whistle for some hour and one half while the rest of the village was greeting the Thomas. It was not unusual for the local band to turn out and serenade the Thomas as it proceeded into town. Upon arriving at Alaska, it became obvious that an overland passage would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. This shows Thompson Pass, one of the main passes north of Valdez on the route to Fairbanks, Alaska. You can see by the horse and rider in the pass, the width would not permit the passage of the Thomas. Beyond this, there was some 40 miles of forest, which had a trail wide enough only for dog sleds. And of course, beyond that was the Bering Strait. The original designer of the route had never driven an automobile, much less seen the Bering Strait, which of course at this time froze into pack ice, not pond smooth. The plan was devised to blow a passageway with dynamite through Thompson Pass and cut through some 40 miles of forest to make a path wide enough for the Thomas. Not being able to power its way across the Bering Sea, the plan was to disassemble the Thomas car into its parts, loading those parts onto a dog sled, several dog sleds, transporting them across Bering Strait, reassembling the car in Siberia, and proceeding with the race. The problem was cost. It was estimated to cost at that time some $20,000 just for the passage through Alaska and across Bering Strait. The race committee in New York City was advised of this, and the race was changed in course back to Seattle by steamer to Japan, crossing Japan and continuing on with the race from that point. This gives you a little idea of what the snow was like in Alaska at that time. Those poles along the side to the left were marker poles, some 30 feet tall. It was not unusual for snow to be well over 20 feet. This postcard was sent back illustrating the only viable means of crossing Alaska at that time. It was May 10th, arrival in Yokohama. The competitors, the German and French team, had learned of the change in race plans and had departed San Francisco directly for Japan. For this reason, the Thomas team was given a 24-day handicap. The Germans had also transshipped the car by rail from Utah and were given a 6-day penalty. That would mean that the Germans would have to beat them by some 30 days to win the race. A scene quite common in Japan. the highways being constructed primarily for foot traffic and pedestrian use, it was not unusual to approach a bridge often built at right angles to the main road and literally have to lift the car around the corner. Japan proved to be beautiful this time of year. Every inch of the soil was under cultivation, and this was one of the more relaxing portions of the trip for the crew. A comparison of what we would now consider to be the old and the ancient, the Thomas and a rickshaw. Part of the difficulty in transiting the relatively short distance of Japan, some 90 miles, which ultimately required total distance of over 380, were the mountain ranges. A number of switchbacks and extremely narrow paths made it impossible for the Thomas to ascend the mountain under its own power. At several points, they would hire local coolies, which proceeded to hook a rope onto the front of the car and literally drag under manpower the vehicle to the top. Of course, the backside being too steep for the brakes to hold, the coolies were then attached to the rear of the car and literally lowered the Thomas down the side of the mountain. With no passenger bridges crossing many of the rivers in Japan, it became necessary to take to the rail bridges. Here the car was hand-loaded onto two push cars, and the entire assembly was transited across the river. This is the entry into Vladivostok, Siberia. It was on May the 13th. The German car was already in the lead at this time. The French car, the Didion, was also in Vladivostok. It was here that St. Chaffrey, driver and captain of the French car, found that financial support had been withdrawn for his team by the Marquis Didion. He had proceeded before the landing of the American car to buy up all of the gasoline at the fuel point in Vladivostok. He approached George with the proposal that he join the American team to complete the race to Paris. Of course, all passenger spaces were taken on the Thomas, and St. Chaffrey replied that the Thomas would not be able to proceed without his gasoline. George went to a local German trading company, and there he asked to see the manager. The manager was not available, but a clerk assisted him, where he was able to acquire some 300 gallons of gasoline. He paid a deposit, and just as he was leaving the building, the German manager appeared. George explaining his predicament. The German manager replied, "Well, I'm sorry, we have no gasoline." He explained, of course, that he had just paid a deposit, but the German, knowing that his national team was in the lead, said, "I'm sorry." It was here that George replied, "We have a New York Times correspondent on the car, and if you do not release the gasoline to us, we will cable a story to New York City, and the world will know the true nature of German sportsmanship. I will come back tomorrow morning for your answer." Upon his return the next morning, the German manager welcomed George and presented him with the gasoline. This gives you a little idea of what it was like to drive through the tundra area of Siberia at that time. Oftentimes horses were not available, so again, local residents and coolies were enlisted to literally drag the car through the more difficult passages. This gives you an idea of how difficult conditions actually were. It was not unusual for horses to actually drown in the depths of the mud at that time. This is one of the more famous moments in the race. This is the German team. As a matter of fact, you can see Lieutenant Copens on the end of the pry bar. The American team came around a corner to view the German team and its predicament, and displaying the height of American sportsmanship, tossed them a line and towed the German competitor out. Lieutenant Copens was so grateful for that act of sportsmanship that he broke out a bottle of cognac, which he was going to save for their triumphant finish in Paris, and shared it with the Americans. This is a painting of that event. Of course, the Americans weren't immune to the terrible conditions, and a short time later found themselves in a very similar predicament. Unfortunately, the Germans weren't available to offer assistance. It had been raining for the last 17 of 20 days, and mud and rivers were overflowing. The crew would have to walk in front of the car to find the safest passage through the rivers. The crew always risked the prospect of strong currents sweeping both them and the car away. In Siberia, the Russian army officers proved to be quite helpful. Hans Hansen was able to speak fluent Russian and was able to enlist the aid of the local military officers. Here, Russian Cossacks are shown as they prepare to assist the crew in removing the Thomas. Here, aid's being enlisted from a local postman. This is a Telga, a single horse-drawn vehicle which was used to dispatch the mail, and this was the need for the Telga. The Russian Tsar had offered a $1,000 reward for the first team entering St. Petersburg, which is now Leningrad. The Germans at this point were still ahead, some 2 days, and of course won the prize. The crew did take time to stop at this monument, which commemorated 1,000 years of Russian rule. This is the Black Forest on their way to Berlin. Also proved a considerable obstacle in that many areas through the heavily wooded sections were too narrow for the car. Again, they had to resort to clearing a way wide enough for passage. Insects also proved a great obstacle in that clouds of mosquitoes would descend upon the crew. This was July the 27th, entering Berlin. The Protos had already entered Berlin 2 days prior, and the German people felt that the German team would be the obvious winner. The Americans tried to remind them of the fact that